At 30,000 feet, the tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. A flight attendant, flushed with frustration, stood over a passenger in tears. But it was the quiet, clear voice of an 8-year-old boy that silenced the entire plane. According to the Air Carrier Access Act of 1986, this is the incredible true story of Leo, a young boy with a genius-level understanding of the law who stood up to an airline to defend a stranger. But his journey didn't start there. It began 48 hours earlier, with a heartbreaking email that would send him and his mother on a mission of love, loss, and reconciliation. What this young boy did is truly extraordinary. Have you ever witnessed a moment of unexpected courage that left you speechless? We'd love to hear your story in the comments below as we unravel the events that led to this stunning confrontation in the sky. The tension in the airplane cabin was a physical thing, a suffocating blanket of silence that had fallen over the drone of the engines. Every passenger sat frozen, their eyes locked on the small figure standing defiantly in the aisle. He was 8 years old, and in that moment he seemed to command the entire aircraft. Leo stood tall, despite his diminutive stature. His chin was raised, his dark eyes flashing with an intelligence that seemed far beyond his years. The flight attendant, a woman who had been professionally but sternly berating a passenger moments earlier, now stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. According to the Air Carrier Access Act of 1986, Leo stated, his voice clear and unwavering, ringing through the stunned silence. Specifically Title 14, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 382.87, a passenger has the legal right to be accompanied by their medical device without additional charges or restrictive seat assignments. He paused, letting the words hang in the recycled air. Furthermore, he continued, the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in places of public accommodation, which includes this aircraft operated by your airline. A collective, quiet gasp rippled through the cabin. In first class, a businessman lowered his financial newspaper. A few rows back, a group of college students stopped their whispered conversation. Even a baby who had been fussing seemed to quiet, as if in stunned recognition of the gravity of the moment. The flight attendant's face flushed a deep crimson. Young man, she began, her professional composure cracking, I don't think you understand the complexities. Understand perfectly, Leo interrupted, his voice polite but firm. He reached into his small, dinosaur-themed backpack and pulled out a neatly folded document. I've taken the liberty of printing the relevant regulations. Would you like to review them? Or shall we discuss this matter with your supervisor and the designated air carrier compliance officer? I'm quite certain they would be interested to know that you are threatening to remove a passenger with a documented disability from this flight. The cabin was electric. The woman he was defending looked on with tear-filled, astonished eyes. The flight attendant was speechless, staring at the printed papers being offered to her by a child who could barely see over the seatbacks. Who was this child? How did an 8-year-old know more about aviation law than a seasoned flight attendant? And what extraordinary set of circumstances had brought him to this moment of quiet, powerful confrontation at 30,000 feet in the air? To understand the remarkable scene unfolding on Flight 2187, we need to go back to where it all truly began, just 48 hours earlier. 2 days before the flight, Clara sat at her small kitchen table, staring at an email that had arrived like a stone dropping into the placid surface of her life. A gentle spring breeze carried the scent of magnolia through the open window of their modest Chicago apartment, but she couldn't appreciate it. Her fingers hovered over her laptop, her eyes rereading the words from her sister, Lena, in San Francisco. Mom's not doing well, Clara. The doctors are saying weeks, maybe days. If you want to say goodbye, you need to come now. I know things have been tight since Mark left, but I can help with the tickets. Just please come. She's asking for you and Leo. Clara brushed a tear away with the back of her hand. She hadn't spoken to her mother, Eleanor, in nearly 3 years. Not since the explosive argument that had followed her divorce. It was a war of pride and stubbornness, waged on both sides, that had created a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Until now. Now, Time was running out. She was so lost in her thoughts, she didn't hear the soft footsteps approaching. "Mom? Are you okay?" Clara looked up to see her son, Leo, standing in the doorway. His NASA t-shirt was slightly too big for his slender frame, and a concerned expression aged his young face. At 8 years old, Leo already carried himself with the gravity of someone much older. His teachers called him an old soul. His father had called him too serious for his own good. Clara just called him extraordinary. "I'm fine, baby," she said, quickly wiping away another tear. "Just talking with Aunt Lena." Leo's face brightened instantly. "Is she still helping build those massive computer systems?" "The quantum ones." Clara nodded, a small smile touching her lips, marveling at her son's memory. Lena had mentioned her work in quantum computing exactly once during a visit 2 years ago. Somehow, Leo had not only remembered, but had subsequently read everything he could find on the subject. "Yes, she is," Clara replied. "But she called about Grandma Eleanor. She's not doing very well." Leo's smile faded. He approached the table slowly, his eyes never leaving his mother's face. His directness, as always, was startling. "Is she going to die?" Clara didn't flinch. Leo had never been one for euphemisms or sugarcoating. He preferred facts, clear and unvarnished. "The doctors think so, yes." "Soon." Leo nodded, processing this information with the same methodical approach he applied to everything. "Then we need to go see her." "It's complicated, Leo. The tickets would be expensive, and I'd have to take time off work, and Grandma is dying," Leo stated simply, not as an accusation, but as a fact. According to the 5 stages of grief identified by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, denial is just the first stage. Avoidance is counterproductive. "We should go." Clara couldn't help but let out a small, watery laugh despite the heaviness in her chest. Of course her 8-year-old would reference Kubler-Ross. "When did you become such an expert on grief?" "Last month, after Mr. Henderson's dog died. He was very sad during our chess club meeting, so I read 3 books about it. I wanted to understand how to help him." Clara's heart swelled with a familiar mixture of pride and wonder. This was Leo, intensely curious, profoundly empathetic, and determined to understand the world through research. When he became interested in something, he didn't just scratch the surface. He dove deep, absorbing information like a sponge. "Aunt Lena says she can help with the tickets," Clara admitted, her voice soft. Leo nodded decisively. "Then we should accept her help. It is not charity if it's family. It's what the Giving Tree is all about." "The Giving Tree?" Clara raised an eyebrow. "The book by Shel Silverstein you used to read to me," he explained patiently. "The tree gives everything to the boy because it loves him. Aunt Lena wants to give us tickets because she loves us. And it would be a mutually beneficial arrangement. We get to see Grandma, and Aunt Lena receives the emotional support of having her family present during a difficult time." Clara laughed softly, the sound less strained this time. "You make a compelling argument, counselor." Leo's eyes lit up at the reference. Ever since he discovered a box of old Law and Order DVDs at a garage sale, he'd been obsessed with the legal system. He'd watched every episode and checked out law books from the library that were far beyond his grade level. "So, we're going?" he asked, his voice filled with hope. Clara took a deep breath, the first one that felt like it truly filled her lungs all morning. She looked at her extraordinary son, who saw the world not as a series of obstacles, but as a set of problems to be solved with logic and love. She nodded. "Yes, we're going." "When will we leave?" "As soon as possible. Probably the day after tomorrow." Leo's expression turned serious again. "Will you be okay? Seeing Grandma after everything?" The question hit Clara hard. Sometimes she forgot how perceptive he was, how much he observed and understood despite her efforts to shield him from adult complications. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "It's been a long time, and we said some pretty hurtful things to each other." Leo nodded thoughtfully. In the case of Hatfield v. McCoy, the feud lasted for generations because neither side would take the first step toward reconciliation. A wise judge once wrote that pride is the enemy of peace. Clara stared at her son, Is that a real case? A hint of a smile played at the corner of Leo's mouth. No, but it sounded good, didn't it? For the first time that day, Clara laughed, genuinely and freely. She reached across the table and squeezed her son's small hand. It sounded very wise. Thank you, Leo. As Leo headed back to his room, presumably to begin researching San Francisco or hospital protocols, Clara turned back to her laptop. She replied to Lena's email with just 3 words, a promise whispered across the distance. We're coming home. The next 36 hours passed in a blur of activity. Clara arranged for emergency family leave from her accounting firm, her hands shaking slightly as she explained the situation. Leo, in stark contrast, methodically packed his own suitcase, including 5 thick books on law and medicine that he insisted might be relevant to our situation. By the time they arrived at O'Hare International Airport early Thursday morning, Clara was running on nerves and coffee. Leo, on the other hand, was practically vibrating with a calm excitement. Did you know that commercial planes fly at an average altitude of 35,000 feet? He asked as they navigated the crowded terminal. That's higher than Mount Everest. And the cabin pressure is maintained at an equivalent of 8,000 feet, which is why some people experience discomfort. Is that right? Clara murmured, distracted by the check-in signs. Yes. Also, airplane windows are rounded because square ones caused structural failures in the de Havilland Comet in 1954, leading to multiple crashes. He said it with such earnestness. It's actually very reassuring. It demonstrates how aviation safety has evolved through learning from past incidents. The statistical probability of being in a commercial airplane accident is approximately 1 in 11 million. An elderly couple in line ahead of them turned around, the man's bushy white eyebrows raised in surprise. Young man, you certainly know your aviation facts, he said, his voice warm with amusement. Leo nodded seriously. I researched air travel extensively last night to prepare for our journey and to alleviate any anxiety my mother might be experiencing. The man's wife nudged him, her eyes twinkling. George, remember when our David went through his dinosaur phase? This little one reminds me of him. David preferred reptiles to aviation, Leo stated matter-of-factly. There are significant differences between paleontology and aeronautical engineering, though both rely heavily on principles of physics. The couple exchanged bemused glances, while Clara suppressed a smile. This was typical Leo. She tried to explain. My son has a very active imagination. Not imagination, Mom. Research, Leo corrected gently. There is a fundamental difference. The elderly woman, Helen, laughed delightedly. Well, whatever you call it, it's wonderful. Are you two going on vacation? Clara hesitated, but Leo answered before she could formulate a response. We're going to San Francisco to see my grandmother before she dies. The doctors say she only has days left. It's terminal cancer. The blunt statement hung in the air for an uncomfortable moment before Helen's face softened with deep compassion. Oh, I am so sorry to hear that, dear, she said, reaching out to touch Clara's arm gently. Family is what matters most in times like these. Clara nodded, grateful for the woman's kindness. Yes, it is. If you need anything during the flight, we're in seats 14A and B, the woman offered. I'm Helen, and this is my husband, George. Thank you, Helen. I'm Clara, and this is Leo. As they reached the front of the line, Clara felt a small wave of relief. At least there would be friendly faces on the plane. She handed over their IDs, trying to ignore the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. It wasn't just the flying that made her nervous. It was what awaited them in San Francisco. Mom, Leo whispered as they moved toward security, your heart rate is elevated. Your breathing pattern suggests anxiety. Remember the 4-7-8 technique Dr. Powell taught you? Clara looked down at her son in amazement. She followed his advice, breathing in for 4 counts, holding for 7, and exhaling for 8. The tightness in her chest eased slightly. Better? Leo asked. Better, she confirmed. Thank you. You're welcome. Now, did you remember to pack my prescription inhaler in your carry-on? TSA regulations allow for medically necessary liquids, but they must be declared. Got it right here. Clara patted her bag. Along with your documentation. Leo nodded, satisfied. Good. Proper preparation prevents poor performance. Did you read that in one of your books? No. Coach Taylor says it during soccer practice. But it applies to air travel, too. The security screening went smoothly, and by the time they reached their gate, boarding was already underway. As they shuffled forward with the crowd, Leo clutched his backpack with one hand and Clara's fingers with the other. For all his confident knowledge, she could feel a slight tremor in his small hand. He was still just 8 years old. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, Clara squeezed his hand reassuringly. Ready for an adventure? Leo looked up at her, his dark eyes serious behind his glasses. I'm ready. Are you? The question held more weight than its simple words suggested. Was she ready? Ready to face her mother? To confront the past? I think so, she answered honestly. And if I'm not, I have you to help me through it. Leo nodded solemnly. We'll help each other. That's what family does. With those words hanging between them, they stepped onto the plane, unaware that their personal journey was about to become a very public one. The cabin of Flight 2187 was nearly full. As they approached their row, Clara noticed a man already seated in the aisle seat. He was middle-aged with salt and pepper hair and an expensive-looking suit, engrossed in something on his tablet. He gave a curt nod as Clara politely asked to get by, barely looking up. He's reviewing legal documents. Leo whispered a bit too loudly as they settled in. I can see the case citation formats. Shoo, Clara cautioned, noticing the man glance their way with raised eyebrows. As the plane took off, Chicago falling away beneath them, Leo's hand found Clara's, his palms slightly sweaty despite his earlier confidence. She gave his hand a gentle squeeze. The statistical probability, right? She whispered. 1 in 11 million, he confirmed, his voice steady. But knowledge doesn't always override emotional responses. That's why exposure therapy is often more effective than cognitive approaches for treating specific phobias. The businessman beside them, who they would soon know as Arthur Vance, let out a barely audible sigh. Once they were cruising and the seatbelt sign was off, Leo turned to the man. Sir, he said suddenly, are you a lawyer? Arthur looked up, surprised. I am. How did you know? Your documents have distinctive legal formatting, Leo explained. And you're reviewing what appears to be case law regarding corporate liability. Also, your watch is a Rolex Submariner, commonly associated with successful professionals in fields like law. Arthur stared at Leo for a long moment, then let out a short, incredulous laugh. Well, that's quite observant. Yes, I'm an attorney. Corporate law. That's fascinating, Leo said, his eyes lighting up. I'm very interested in law myself. Are you familiar with the case of Liebeck v. McDonald's restaurants? It's often mischaracterized as a frivolous lawsuit, but the facts actually support the plaintiff's claims regarding corporate negligence and the duty of care. Arthur's eyebrows shot up. He glanced at Clara. My son has diverse interests, she explained with a small smile. I see, Arthur said, clearly bemused. He turned back to Leo. Yes, I'm familiar with the case. And you're right, it's widely misunderstood. He seemed to make a decision, his professional demeanor warming. I'm Arthur Vance. The conversation might have continued, but at that moment, a commotion several rows ahead caught everyone's attention. A woman's voice, raised in distress, carried down the cabin. But I specifically requested a seat accommodation. This is medical equipment, not an optional luxury. Clara saw a flight attendant standing beside a row, speaking to a woman who remained seated but whose agitation was clear. Ma'am, the flight attendant was saying, her voice calm, but with an edge of impatience. According to our records, no such request was documented for this flight. I spoke to your customer service representative personally, the woman insisted. Leo tugged at Clara's sleeve. What's happening? I'm not sure, honey, Clara whispered back. Someone's having an issue with their seating. The flight attendant's next words were audible throughout the now quieting cabin. I'm sorry, but if you're unable to stow the equipment properly, we may need to consider other options. Other options? The woman's voice rose. Are you threatening to remove me from this flight? The dispute continued, with the flight attendant becoming increasingly firm. From what Clara could gather, the woman, Grace Miller, had a medical device that required additional space, which she claimed to have arranged in advance. Arthur shook his head slightly. Airlines are notorious for these communication breakdowns, he commented quietly. Leo had gone very still, listening intently. Mom, he said finally, his voice low but urgent, I think she's being discriminated against. Leo, we don't know the full situation, Clara cautioned. But I heard her mention the Air Carrier Access Act, and the flight attendant dismissed it. Leo persisted. That's a real law. It protects people with disabilities on airplanes. The conversation ahead grew louder again. The passenger's voice carried a note of desperation. Then perhaps you should have confirmed your arrangements before boarding, came the flight attendant's sharp reply. As it stands, the device is creating an obstruction, which is a safety violation. Leo fidgeted in his seat, clearly distressed. Mom, she's right. The airline is wrong. He whispered urgently. It's not our place to intervene, Leo, Clara said gently, though she too felt sympathy for the woman. If you're finding yourself captivated by Leo's incredible sense of justice, we'd love it if you'd let us know in the comments. It means the world to us to hear how these stories connect with you. Now, back to the story. Before Clara could say another word, Leo had unbuckled his seatbelt. The click echoed in the tense silence of their row. He stood up, a small, determined figure against the backdrop of the cabin. Leo, what are you doing? Clara hissed, reaching for him, but he was already moving, navigating the narrow aisle with a purpose that was absolute. Panic flared in her throat, but she was frozen, watching her son walk toward the conflict. He stopped beside the row where Grace Miller sat in tears, and the flight attendant stood with her arms crossed. Excuse me, Leo said, his voice cutting through the tension. I believe there may be a misunderstanding regarding federal aviation regulations. The flight attendant, the senior of the two, turned in surprise, her expression hardening at the sight of a child inserting himself into the situation. Young man, please return to your seat immediately, she said firmly. This is a matter for airline staff to handle. With all due respect, Leo continued, his voice steady despite the eyes of dozens of passengers now fixed on him. This is actually a matter of federal law. It was at this moment that he stood his tallest, and the scene that had been a flash in the opening of our story now unfolded in its full, breathtaking entirety. He was no longer just a boy. He was an advocate. According to the Air Carrier Access Act of 1986, specifically Title 14, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 382.87, a passenger has the legal right to be accompanied by their medical device without additional charges or restrictive seat assignments, he recited, his tone clear and precise. Furthermore, the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in places of public accommodation, which includes this aircraft, operated by your airline. A stunned silence fell over the front half of the cabin. Grace Miller looked from Leo to the flight attendants with wide, astonished eyes. From his seat, Arthur Vance leaned forward, a look of utter disbelief and profound admiration on his face. Clara had stood up, her heart pounding, ready to pull her son back, but she found she couldn't move. She was witnessing something extraordinary. The flight attendant's face was a mask of incredulity. Young man, while your concern is noted, airline operations are complex and governed by multiple regulations. Now please, return to your seat. It was then that Leo reached into his small, dinosaur-themed backpack. The playful, childish nature of the bag was a stark contrast to the gravity of his actions. He pulled out a neatly folded document. I understand perfectly, he said, unfolding the papers. I have taken the liberty of printing the relevant regulations. Would you like to review them? Or shall we discuss this matter with your supervisor and the designated air carrier compliance officer? I'm quite certain they would be interested to know that you are threatening to remove a passenger with a documented disability from this flight. He held the papers out. The flight attendant stared at them as if they were a snake. Around them, passengers had begun to murmur, and the distinct shapes of phones being raised to record the event became visible. The second flight attendant leaned in and whispered something urgently to her colleague. The senior attendant's composure was visibly cracking. She looked from Leo's unwavering gaze to Grace Miller's tear-streaked face, then to the watching eyes of the other passengers. Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, that she was on shaky legal and public ground. "Perhaps," she said finally, her voice tight, "we should continue this discussion in a more private setting." "I'm comfortable discussing it here," Grace Miller said, a new confidence in her voice, borrowed from her unlikely champion. "Unless you are now prepared to honor the accommodation I requested and was legally entitled to." The flight attendant looked at Leo one last time, then reached for the aircraft phone. "Let me consult with the captain," she said, and stepped away. In that brief interlude, Grace turned to Leo, her eyes shining with unshed tears of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm Grace Miller." "I'm Leo," he replied with the formal precision that was so characteristic of him. It is a statistical fact that individuals are less likely to advocate for themselves when confronted with authority figures. "I merely provided factual context to support your position." Grace smiled, the weariness in her face momentarily lifting. "Well, your factual context might have just saved me from being removed from this flight. I need to get to San Francisco for my daughter's graduation." The senior flight attendant returned, her demeanor noticeably changed. "Ms. Miller," she said, her tone now professional and conciliatory, "we have reviewed the situation and will be able to accommodate your medical device as required. We apologize for the confusion." She then turned to Leo, something akin to reluctant respect in her expression. "Young man, in the future, please remain seated during such discussions and allow our staff to handle passenger concerns." Leo considered this for a moment. "I understand the importance of procedure," he said seriously. "But justice sometimes requires intervention. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Another murmur ran through the watching passengers, followed this time by a smattering of applause from several rows. The flight attendant's lips thinned, but she merely nodded and moved away. "We should return to our seats," Clara said quietly, gently guiding her son back down the aisle. As they passed, several passengers smiled or nodded at Leo. An elderly man reached out and patted his shoulder. As they walked back to their seats, a quiet ripple of applause following them. The atmosphere on Flight 2187 had fundamentally changed. The anonymous tension had been replaced by a shared sense of wonder, all centered on the small boy, now settling back into his seat, as if he hadn't just single-handedly altered the course of their flight. "That," Arthur Vance said as they settled back into their seats, the last of his earlier aloofness completely gone, "was quite remarkable." Leo shrugged, though Clara could see a pleased flush on his cheeks. "It was just facts. Facts don't care about age or authority. A perspective many attorneys spend years trying to embrace," Arthur said with a genuine smile. "You know, Leo, I think you might have a future in advocacy law." For the rest of the flight, Arthur set aside his work, engaging Leo in conversations about famous legal cases and ethical dilemmas. Clara listened with quiet pride as her son held his own in discussions that would challenge many adults. Later, Arthur turned to her. "Your son is truly extraordinary, Ms. Clara." "And yes, he is. Though sometimes she trailed off, not wanting to say challenging within Leo's hearing. "Different," Arthur suggested, understanding in his eyes. "Exactly," she said with a grateful smile. "Mom worries that I don't have enough friends my own age," Leo interjected matter-of-factly, not looking up from a book he'd begun reading. "But peer relationships are statistically more successful when based on shared interests rather than arbitrary age groupings." He turned a page. "The school psychologist suggested I might be on the autism spectrum, but Mom says labels aren't as important as understanding individual needs." Clara felt a rush of emotion. Her son had overheard that private, difficult conversation with his teacher. "Your mom sounds very wise," Arthur said softly. "She is," Leo agreed simply, and returned to his book. As the plane began its descent into San Francisco, Leo once again pressed his face to the window. The city came into view, the iconic Golden Gate Bridge, the base sparkling in the afternoon sun. He grew quiet. As the plane touched down with a slight bump, Leo reached for Clara's hand. This time, she knew it wasn't fear of flying. "Mom," he said, his voice smaller than it had been all day, "what if Grandma doesn't remember me?" The question caught Clara off guard. In all their preparations, Leo had approached his grandmother's illness with a clinical detachment. This was the first time he'd expressed a personal, childlike fear. "Oh, Leo," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "She remembers you. I promise. In her emails to Aunt Lena, she always asks about you. Always." As they deplaned, Arthur Vance stopped them. "It was a true pleasure meeting you both," he said to Clara, handing her a business card. Then he produced a second card and solemnly handed it to the boy. "And Leo, when you're ready for that legal career, call me. We could use minds like yours." In the terminal, Clara spotted Lena immediately, her sister's vibrant red dress a beacon in the crowd. For a moment, she froze, overwhelmed. But then Lena saw them and waved frantically. "Aunt Lena," Leo called, breaking away and running toward her. Lena knelt and caught him in a fierce hug. Then Lena was approaching Clara, her expression a complex mixture of love, old hurts, and the shared sadness of lost time. "Clara," Lena said, her voice thick with emotion. "Lena," Clara replied, and then they were embracing, years of distance collapsing in an instant. "I'm sorry it took this to bring us back together. Mom always said we were too stubborn for our own good," Lena whispered, wiping her eyes. Guess she was right. The first confrontation was over, but the most deeply personal one was about to begin. The hospital corridor stretched before them, its sterile white walls a stark contrast to the vibrant San Francisco afternoon they'd left behind. Lena led the way, navigating the hallways with the sad ease of someone who had made this journey many times. "She's on the oncology floor," Lena explained as they waited for an elevator. "Room 412. As they stepped out onto the floor, Clara felt her steps slow. "What do I say to her, Lena? After everything?" "You don't have to say anything special," Lena said gently. "Just be here. That's all she wants." She paused, then added, "She's different, Clara. Cancer has a way of clarifying things." Leo, who had been observing them, spoke up. "Mom, psychological research indicates that unresolved relational conflicts are a significant source of end-of-life distress. The likelihood of achieving meaningful resolution increases dramatically with direct communication, even if it's initially uncomfortable." Both sisters turned to look at the small boy, his serious face upturned. Lena laughed softly. "When did you get so wise?" "I read extensively," Leo replied simply. Lena knocked softly on the door to room 412, then pushed it open. "Mom, look who's here." Clara took a deep breath and followed. The room was unexpectedly bright, and there, propped up against pillows, was Eleanor. She was a diminished version of the strong, vibrant woman Clara remembered. Her once robust frame had shrunk, her skin was pale, and her hair was a sparse white cap. But her eyes, those sharp, perceptive eyes, were the same, and they lit up as they fell upon her daughter and grandson. "Clara," Eleanor breathed, her voice thin but clear. "You came." Something broke inside Clara. 3 years of anger and pride crumbled away. She moved swiftly to the bedside, taking her mother's frail hand. "Of course I came," she whispered. "I'm so sorry it took me so long." Eleanor shook her head slightly. "No apologies. Not today." Her gaze shifted to Leo. "And this can't be my little Leo. You've grown so much." "Hello, Grandma," Leo said formally. "I'm approximately 4 feet 7 inches tall now, which is in the 89th percentile for my age group. It is statistically likely I will reach a height of at least 5 feet 11 inches as an adult." A surprised laugh escaped Eleanor, a sound that transformed her tired face. "Well, that's quite specific. Come closer." Leo approached, studying his grandmother. "You look different than I remember," he said candidly. "That's to be expected, though. Cancer cachexia affects approximately 50 to 80% of cancer patients. It's characterized by involuntary weight loss and muscle wasting. Lena made a small sound of dismay, but Eleanor merely nodded, regarding her grandson with newfound interest. You're absolutely right, young man. You clearly know your medical terminology. I find multiple disciplines interesting, Leo confirmed. Eleanor's eyebrows rose. She glanced at Clara with a questioning look. He's academically advanced, Clara explained with a small smile. Extraordinary, Eleanor murmured. He reminds me of your father, Clara. Always had his nose in a book, learning about things most people never thought to question. The mention of her father, who had died when Clara was just 15, brought a fresh ache to her heart. It was then that Lena told Eleanor about the incident on the plane. As she recounted the story, Eleanor's eyes widened. She listened, rapt, as Leo explained the legal principles he'd invoked. When the story was finished, Eleanor looked at her grandson, her eyes filled with a profound wonder. This child, she said, her voice filled with emotion, is absolutely extraordinary. I'm in the 99.9th percentile for cognitive processing, Leo offered helpfully, but I still struggle with understanding social cues. Every statistical advantage comes with corresponding challenges. The frank self-assessment seemed to touch Eleanor deeply. She reached out a trembling hand to brush Leo's cheek. You are perfect exactly as you are, she said firmly. Later, while Lena was out of the room, Eleanor beckoned Clara closer. He reminds me so much of my father, she said, her eyes on Leo, who was now absorbed in a medical textbook. Your grandfather? I barely remember him, Clara admitted. He was a civil rights attorney in the 60s. Eleanor continued, her voice a soft whisper of memory. Took on cases no one else would touch. Stood up against systemic injustice when it was dangerous to do so. He used to say that the law, properly understood and applied, was the great equalizer. She glanced at Leo. I think that same spirit lives in your son. The observation sent a shiver of recognition through Clara. It felt right. This thread of justice and courage, running through the generations, now manifesting in her extraordinary child. She looked at her son, and then at her mother, and for the first time in 3 long years, the chasm between them was gone, bridged by the remarkable boy they both loved. In that sunlit hospital room, years of silence and misunderstanding began to dissolve, replaced by the simple, profound truth of a family finding its way back to each other. But as the afternoon sun cast long shadows, they all knew that their time together was measured not in days, but in precious, fleeting hours. The next morning, the dreaded call came from the doctor. Eleanor's condition had deteriorated rapidly overnight. Time was running out. They rushed to the hospital, a silent, tense energy in the car. The change in Eleanor was stark. She was much weaker, her breathing shallow and labored, drifting in and out of consciousness. The doctor gently explained that she was transitioning, that the end was near. For hours, they sat with her. Clara and Lena held her hands, sharing quiet memories, their voices a soft murmur in the hushed room. Leo sat in a large armchair, reading, but Clara knew he was absorbing every sound, every change in the atmosphere. Late in the afternoon, during a period of lucidity, Eleanor beckoned her daughters close. Promise me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Don't waste time on petty disagreements. Life is too short. Stay connected. Be there for each other and for him. Her eyes flickered toward Leo. That boy is going to change the world. He'll need you both. We promise, Mom, Clara said, her voice thick with tears, reaching across the bed to take Lena's hand. Later, as Eleanor slept, Leo approached the bed. He had been quiet for a long time. Grandma, he said softly, I brought something for you. From his backpack, he withdrew a carefully folded piece of paper. It's a letter I wrote. It explains why meeting you has been statistically significant in my personal development, despite the brevity of our acquaintance. With trembling hands, Eleanor accepted the letter. Tears gathered in her eyes as she unfolded it. Would you read it to me, Leo? She whispered. My eyes aren't what they used to be. Leo nodded. He took the paper back and cleared his throat, his young voice steady and clear in the quiet room. Dear Grandma, he began. While our direct interaction has been limited to approximately 5.2 hours as of the writing of this letter, I have calculated that your influence on my existence is disproportionately significant when compared to the temporal parameters of our relationship. Clara watched in wonder, tears streaming down her face, as her son continued reading a love letter written in the language of science. Your genetic contribution constitutes approximately 25% of my DNA, but your impact extends beyond mere biology. Through Mom's stories and our brief but meaningful interactions, I have identified 17 specific characteristics that appear to have been transmitted through our familial line, including analytical thinking, a commitment to justice, and resilience in the face of adversity. Eleanor listened with rapt attention, her eyes never leaving Leo's face. While I recognize that your physical presence in my future development will be limited by biological inevitability, Leo read on, I want to assure you that your influence will continue. It will continue through the principles you have demonstrated and the legacy you have created. Furthermore, I commit to researching your life more thoroughly, to better understand the historical and personal context that shaped your experiences. He paused, and his voice grew softer, losing some of its clinical precision and gaining a new layer of raw emotion. In conclusion, I wish to express gratitude for your role in the statistical improbability that is my existence. The specific combination of genetic material, familial values, and historical circumstances that resulted in me would have been impossible without your participation in the causal chain. That fact alone merits acknowledgement and profound appreciation. Sincerely, Leo, your grandson, and a beneficiary of your legacy. He looked up from the paper, meeting his grandmother's tearful gaze. For a long moment, the only sound was the gentle beeping of the monitors. Then, with evident effort, Eleanor raised a hand to touch Leo's cheek. That, she whispered, her voice breaking, is the most beautiful letter I have ever received. She focused on Clara and Lena one last time, a flicker of her old strength returning to her eyes. I made mistakes, she whispered, but I always loved you, always believed in you. She looked at Clara. So proud of the woman you are, the mother you are. Her gaze shifted to Lena. So proud of your brilliant mind. Her eyes drifted toward the sleeping form of Leo, a look of profound love crossing her face. My legacy, she whispered. Not just genes, but justice, courage, truth. Her breathing grew more labored. Then, with a clarity that was startling, her eyes opened wide. Remember, she said, her voice a strong, clear whisper that filled the room. Love is the only thing that matters in the end. Not being right, not pride, just love. With those words, she closed her eyes. She continued to breathe for several more hours, but she never spoke again. In the quiet, pre-dawn hours, with the first hint of morning light filtering through the window, Eleanor took her final, soft breath and was gone. Clara and Lena sat in silence, holding their mother's hands, which were now growing cool. It was Leo, stirring in his chair, who spoke first. He sat up, his gaze going immediately to the still form on the bed. She's gone, he said quietly. It was not a question, but a statement of observed fact. Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Leo slid from the chair and approached the bed. He reached out and gently touched his grandmother's hand. Her body temperature is decreasing, he noted, his voice clinical but gentle. Soon, cellular breakdown will accelerate. He looked up at his mother, his dark eyes filled with a profound, analytical sorrow. But her genetic material continues in us, and her ideas, her values, those continue too, transmitted through social and cultural mechanisms. That's a form of immortality, isn't it? Statistically speaking, her influence will continue to propagate. That is her legacy. In that moment, Clara understood. Her son was not cold. He was finding order in the chaos of grief. He was finding continuity in the face of an ending. Yes, Leo, she whispered, pulling him into a hug. That's exactly right. And you are the most important part of that legacy. In the quiet stillness of dawn, grief and love held equal space. The physical life of Eleanor had ended, But as her grandson so profoundly understood, her legacy was just beginning to unfold. The journey home would be different from the journey that brought them here. No longer a flight toward an uncertain reunion, but a flight away from a definitive farewell, carrying with them the weight and the wisdom of a life fully lived. 3 days later, Clara and Leo stood at the departure gate, preparing to fly back to Chicago. Lena held them both in a long embrace. "I'll be in Chicago next month," she promised. "And you," she said, kneeling to look Leo in the eye. "I expect bi-weekly email updates on your latest research interests." "I will create a communication schedule," Leo replied seriously, and Lena laughed, pulling him into one last hug. On the plane, as they settled into their seats, Clara looked at her son. "Leo," she said softly, "I've been thinking about what happened on our flight here. I've always taught you to respect rules, but you recognized something I didn't. That sometimes standing up for what's right is more important than following an unjust rule." Leo considered this thoughtfully. Authority derives its legitimacy from the consistent and equitable application of just principles, he said. When those principles are violated, intervention is not disrespectful. It is a reinforcement of the foundational values that the authority is meant to uphold. Clara marveled yet again at the brilliant, compassionate mind of her son. "Grandma was right about you," she said softly. "You're going to change the world someday." Statistical probabilities regarding any individual's large-scale impact are difficult to calculate, he replied. "But I do intend to apply my cognitive abilities to socially beneficial outcomes." As the plane accelerated down the runway, Leo reached for Clara's hand, his grip steady and sure. As they lifted off, San Francisco falling away beneath them, he spoke again. "Mom," he said quietly, "I have been analyzing our experience with Grandma, and I have reached a preliminary conclusion." "What's that, sweetie?" "The data strongly suggests that the quality of human connections has a more significant impact on subjective well-being than almost any other variable," he stated. In other words, relationships matter more than achievements or acquisitions. Grandma was empirically correct in her final advice. Tears pricked Clara's eyes. It was her son's unique way of processing and affirming the wisdom his grandmother had shared. "Yes, she was," Clara agreed softly. "Relationships are what matter most." Leo nodded, satisfied. "I have adjusted my personal priority matrix accordingly," he informed her solemnly. "While I will continue to pursue knowledge acquisition, I will also allocate increased resources to relationship development and maintenance. Beginning with you and Aunt Lena." The statement, so formal and yet so full of love, filled Clara's heart. As the plane climbed above the clouds, she gazed out the window. The journey that had begun with an act of public justice had ended with a lesson in private love. Beside her, Leo had opened one of his great-grandfather's old law books, his small finger tracing the annotations in the margins. The inheritance was more than just an object. It was a legacy of courage, of truth, and of love, now being carried forward into the future by one extraordinary little boy.